Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of our friends live in the world. This is the .NET Doc Show. I'm David Pine, your host, here with my good friend and co-host, Scott Addy. So the .NET Doc Show is basically a play on words. We consider ourselves doctors of .NET, and what that really means is that we prescribe healthy choices to developers around the world. Best practices, things like that, things to consider. We take a look into different technology stacks, and so I'm excited to be here. And our guest for today has yet to show up, which is not a big deal. We've come prepared, armed to the teeth with content, willing to share our knowledge. And the one and only Scott Addy needs no introduction, as he's prepared to. Looks like our guest is just now showing up.
Hello, everyone. Hello.
Hey, Daniel.
Hey.
I really apologize because I had some issues with the camera in my laptop. It's like always that everything is fine until 5 minutes before the live. So
No worries. We were just saying that we were going to improvise this entire set, that we were going to make up stuff on the fly and deliver some amazing .NET content. So without further ado, our guest has arrived. Daniel, I don't know how to correctly enunciate your last name.
We can omit it. So it's Krzyczkowski, but it's really hard. So it can be Daniel K. Just it.
Daniel K.
Didn't I tell you, David?
Yes.
Well, we were just talking about this before the show, and I said we would call you Daniel K.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to all of our guests or our attendees for today?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Daniel, and I work as a software engineer in one of the companies located in Warsaw, Poland. It's called Predica. And mostly I work with Microsoft technologies. So, of course, Azure Cloud, and I'm developer. So I'm mostly focused on the application development part. But also recently I jumped into the Microsoft identity. And I'm enjoying discovering different parts of it and securing apps. So I thought that it would be really, really nice to share some samples, some thoughts, and some concepts. So yeah, that's about me. I have a slide in my presentation, but I'm not sure if you want to go through the slides. So yeah, just to contact me and so on.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll just kind of improvise, and you're more than welcome to share your slide deck. Typically what we'll do is we'll have like this little introduction conversation here, introduce the world to you, and you to the world. And what we'll do then is we'll have a checkup where we'll go through some of content that relates to our topic for today. And Scott's going to cover that here in a minute. And then we'll have what's called the hallway track. So for those of you who have never seen our show before, the hallway track is basically a pseudo circle. Imagine a virtual developer conference, or a real life developer conference rather. Those hallway track conversations are where, that's what we're trying to foster, is that sense of companionship, pull people in, let them, ask questions. You can share your content, share your screen, and we'll go for there. Let's do the checkup. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, let's head over. So before I get into the checkup doc today, apparently it's Red Shirt Day. So in case you were wondering.
Unless you're a Microsoft MVP like Daniel here, right?
Yeah, nothing to do with Guthrie. Much respect to him. Anyways, our checkup doc for today. What we have here is a tutorial that focuses on authenticating users and calling a secured Microsoft Graph API from a Blazor WASM application. It's going to take you through several steps here. It'll show you a couple of prereqs. Probably the most important prereq is to actually have a version of the .NET SDK installed, and that could be .NET Core 3.1, it could be .NET 5.0, just as long as it's 3.1 or later. That's really what matters. Second most important prereq here is to have an Azure subscription, because we're going to need to use Azure Active Directory to get this thing working. Now, as you scroll through here, you're going to notice several sections, and I'll talk through this briefly because y'all can read. You first want to register your Blazor WASM app with Azure Active Directory to make all of this work. And the second step there is going to actually be to scaffold the app from the .NET CLI. The tutorial here actually calls for installing the Blazor templates, the project templates. That's not something you would need to do if you're using the .NET 5.0 SDK or later. It used to be that the Blazor templates didn't ship with the SDK. And another thing you're going to notice here is the .NET new command to actually scaffold the project, the Blazor WASM project. File new project, if you're using Visual Studio, would accomplish the same thing. A couple of things to point out here. This .NET new command passes some options you may not have seen before, and so I'll just call out what those options are. The first option you may not have seen is calls graph. Calls graph is an option that indicates to the CLI that the web app will be calling a Microsoft Graph API. This option only applies and can only be used in the .NET new command if your auth option, which is the option just before that, I'll highlight it here, if your auth option is set to either single org, as it is here, or multi-org. And what we're saying when we say auth single org, what does that really mean? It means organizational authentication for a single Azure Active Directory tenant. Next thing you'll do in this tutorial is run the app, and there's another interesting thing here you may not have encountered in the past, and so I'll point that out, is when we run the .NET run command, the equivalent of this in Visual Studio would just be hitting the run button, but .NET run, and we're actually passing the framework option. The reason why we're doing this is because that Blazor WASM project that was scaffolded is, keep in mind, based on ASP.NET Core 3.1. And its target framework is actually .NET Standard 2.1. So we need to tell the .NET Run command which framework we're targeting in this project. The real meat of this tutorial, though, is in this retrieving data section. This is where you're actually going to add some code to your Blazor project to call that Microsoft Graph API, and then ultimately display the user's email somewhere in that app on a page.
So what does Microsoft Graph actually mean? Is that just like a graph representation, or like the object graph of a user, or like what is that?
So it's not, I would have to run through the tutorial at length to grab a better understanding of it, but for the purposes of my explanation here, just think of it as an endpoint we're using to retrieve the user's information.
Got it.
And of course, that user has to be authenticated so that we can retrieve that information. The Graph API is secured, and so that's another piece to this tutorial that it will walk you through. So it's actually in this retrieving data section here that you'll navigate to the Azure portal, update the app's registration, and one thing you have to do here is actually grant what they call mail.read permission. And the reason why you're doing that is one of the goals in this tutorial is to gain access to that user's email address. Without granting that permission, that wouldn't be possible.
Got it. Cool.
A couple other things I'll point out here, and then we'll move on. Some interesting code here has to do with authorization in ASP.NET Core. We're actually creating a custom authorization message handler. So authorization message handler is a class that ships with ASP.NET Core. Our implementation of that we're creating is named this, of course. The purpose of this, the reason why we're doing this, is we want to attach tokens for the necessary scopes to the outgoing requests or the outgoing HTTP response messages to that Graph API. And then you'll wrap things up here by modifying the main method in your program CS file. And really what that's doing is just wiring up all of the plumbing that is needed to make this work in your application. Things like creating a named HTTP client with a base URI set to that Graph API endpoint, And you're going to register that custom handler you created that I pointed out earlier, and that takes place here. And then finally, you'll add authentication. And because we're in a Blazor WASM app, that authentication is going to use msol.js to accomplish everything. You wrap things up here by updating the Razor component for the app. Real quick, let's actually flash up the Akka link for this doc for folks who are interested in reading more. So along the bottom of the screen, you will see the Akka link scrolling. If anything in this doc interested you, take a look at that. One other thing worth pointing out, up at the top of this doc, there is a newer version of this tutorial that's very, very similar based on ASP.NET Core 5.0. And in this paragraph that I'm going to highlight, you will see there is a link to that. Definitely check that out. With that, why don't we move on to the hallway track and see what cool stuff Daniel's going to share with us today.
Awesome.
Awesome.
So Daniel, feel free to share your screen, and we can add that to the stream here for our guests and our attendees. This is really where the meat of the conversation takes place now. So we've shared our content, that's relevant to our conversation. We introduced you to the world, and we're excited to dive in and ask you questions. So we're going to encourage guests to ask questions. They can ask them here. We'll make sure that they get propagated through. We'll show them on screen, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with the presentation,
Sure.
And then with code samples. So let me share my screen. Yeah. Is it visible?
Not yet. There is a button at the bottom here.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I got it. I have it here.
Typically, it's not a problem. We have guests that are punctual and show up on time. That no.
Yeah, I know.
Gotta give you a hard time. Awesome. There you go. You're on now.
Okay. So thank you so much for the introduction. So let me share my screen. So as mentioned before, today I would like to talk about modern authentication for .NET apps with Microsoft Identity Platform. And as mentioned before, there are just a few words about me. If you would like to reach out to me, here is my Twitter handle and also the link to my LinkedIn profile. I also encourage you to check my TechMind Factory blog, where I include some interesting articles, I hope interesting, not only related to Microsoft Identity Platform, but also related to Azure development and some other, I hope, interesting parts of software development with Microsoft Stack. So I encourage you to visit this page. So today, I decided to divide this content between two parts. So first of all, I would like to start with the small presentation, and no worries, I have code samples, I have some demos. I hope that there will be interesting for you. But I would like to start with this first part with the presentation, because this is a short introduction to different parts that we are going to discuss today. So first of all, for those who are not familiar with Microsoft Identity Platform, this is an evolution of Azure Active Directory Developer Platform. And with Microsoft Identity Platform, to make it simple, we can easily secure our applications. It doesn't matter if this is desktop app, if this is Xamarin mobile app, if this is Angular app, so single page application. We can still use Microsoft Identity Platform to secure our applications and to securely communicate with different applications. So for instance, when we would like to call a web API from the web application or from the mobile application, still we can use Microsoft Identity Platform. And today, I would like to talk about two services, about Azure Active Directory and Azure Active Directory Business to Customer, so B2C. And the reason why I decided to divide this content into those two services, I think that today there are not only questions about Azure AD and securing enterprise apps, but also customers are asking about, and users are asking about the access and securing and applications where they can just create an account and start using the application without contacting administrator, for instance. That's why I thought that it would be really nice to show some demos related to those two services. Now, when it comes to the Microsoft Identity Platform, as I mentioned before, we would like to secure our apps, but also we would like to provide some level of flexibility to the end users. So when you think about flexibility, what I mean by that is the fact that some users would like to sign in with their corporate accounts, like company accounts, and use the application. But also you can have those type of users where they would like to create their accounts, so sign up and register, provide some details, and then start using application. And also, there are some users that already have like a social media accounts like Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, etc. And they would like to use those social media accounts to access your applications. So this is why I decided to present those two services, so Azure AD and Azure AD B2C, because I would like to show some interesting scenarios there, including the samples. And of course, when it comes to integration with Microsoft Identity Platform, we have to talk about libraries. Yeah, so we have to somehow integrate those applications. So that is why currently there are two important libraries that developers should be familiar with. So Microsoft Identity Web and Microsoft Identity Client. So MSL, so MSL library, and Microsoft Identity Web. And when it comes to the Microsoft Identity Web, it was released quite recently, I would say, when you compare it to Microsoft Identity Client. And Microsoft Identity Web is the way to go to secure web applications like APIs, for instance, or ASP.NET Core applications, and in general, web apps on the server side. Yeah. And with Microsoft Identity Web Library, we have access to many different important features that we can easily integrate into the source code of our application to provide this user authentication and user authorization. So, as I mentioned, it's also recommended to be used with not only Azure AD, but also if you have application that is secured by Azure Active Directory B2C, this is the way to go. And of course, on the other side, we have those other applications like client applications like desktop or mobile, and we would like to also integrate those applications with Microsoft Identity Platform. And in this case, we should use Microsoft Identity Client Library. So it enables developers to integrate with Microsoft Identity Platform and receive access tokens, ID tokens to authenticate users, to access the APIs, to retrieve the data in a secure way. Yeah. So in this case, we can either acquire the token on behalf of user. So I can sign in and I can say that me as a Daniel, I would like to access a specific API, but also we can access other applications on behalf of the application. Yeah. So it's machine-to-machine communication. So those two libraries are currently available for developers, and today I would like to present some integrations with those two libraries. So that's the main part of the presentation.
So Daniel, if you don't mind, let me go to this slide here. One of the most common questions I hear, and I'm hoping you can provide an answer for our viewers. Given the two options, Azure AD or Azure AD B2C, which one would you use when? What's the big differentiating factor?
That's a very good question, and at the end I will also provide the link to good resource of my friend that created the content about this difference. But for me, what I can say, I would recommend using Azure AD for corporate applications. So let me put an example. You have a company and you already have Azure Active Directory there, and you would like to control the access to the applications owned by your organization. So you would like to have a control on the registration of the users, so who is added to your application, what is the role of this person. So you don't not, so you want to add the person, but you want to also control the groups and roles that this person is assigned to. And on the other side, you have all these kind of apps where you would like to enable users to register themselves and use the application without any requirement on your side to create those accounts for the end users. And to clarify, I would recommend using Azure AD B2C for all the applications that have some connection with end users and customers. So you can try to imagine that if you have like a web application where it's an online store and users can create account, can register, and can create a profile, then sign in and buy something. That's a great case for Azure AD B2C, because also instead of self-registration provided for these users, you can also enable branding for login and registration pages. So you can create a crafted user interface for those users, so they feel like they are inside your application, even if they are redirected to the B2C to sign in. And when it comes, so when it comes to the Azure AD, it's more about corporate applications and more control who have access to each part of your application.
We have a question here, and I'm curious for your unbiased opinion. First of all, are you familiar with Identity Server 4?
Yeah, somehow I had a chance to work with it.
So Basin is asking, does the Identity Web provide as much flexibility as Identity Server 4?
Yeah, so that's I would say that's a tricky question, and what I can say from my perspective, not so. Microsoft Identity Web currently, from my this is my personal opinion, what I see. Microsoft Identity Web is not so mature as Identity Server 4. Yeah. So when it comes to some flexibility and some extensions and I would say combinations with the libraries, Microsoft Identity Web is still not so mature as Identity Server. So I would say that it's not so flexible when it comes to some integrations and custom scenarios. So that's my personal opinion.
Awesome. No, that's what I was hoping for, was your opinion. That's what we value here. So thank you for that.
Okay, so any other questions, or we should move forward, guys?
Damien B, I'm assuming Damien Bowden here, is saying Microsoft Identity Web is just a client. Yep.
It's also worth pointing out that Identity Server 4 option we discussed is a third-party solution. That's not something that ships from Microsoft.
Yeah,
awesome.
That's true.
Cool. Yeah, I think let's jump into code if that's what you've got next for us. We did have another question real quick before we transition over. One of our attendees here was asking if the slides will be made available. I think they want to, take some time.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I can share those slides because there are a few more, but I think that it would be nice to jump to the code and discuss some samples. Yeah, but awesome. Of course I will share those slides.
Cool.
Okay, so let me start, guys, with the identity developer samples. And this is the project that I have on my GitHub. So I will also provide the link. What I did, I tried to collect some samples with integration, to show integration with Microsoft Identity Web and Microsoft Identity Client. So with those two libraries. So the link will be provided after the session. But once you got those samples from my GitHub, you will notice that there is a folder basic and advanced. So let me start with the basic stuff, I would say. So inside those templates, you will notice that there are different kinds of apps. So there is ASP.NET Core web application. There is ASP.NET Core API application. There is also Universal Windows Platform application. And those different apps are integrated with Azure AD and Azure AD B2C. So let me start with the Azure AD standard flow in the UWP application. So let me extend the Visual Studio here. Let me right-click on the project, and if I click Manage NuGet Packages, you will notice that here I have Microsoft Identity Client used. Yeah, so this is this library that you can download from the NuGet package, and you can start using those integrations. So once you have Microsoft Identity Client added, let me start this sample just to show you how it works. So this is my Universal Windows Platform application. As you can see, there is a sign in button. I can click sign in, and then there will be, of course, right now I'm sign in, but let me sign out and do it once again. As you can see, there is this window presented to the user to provide credentials. And please note that this is a separate window outside of the application, but still we are in the context of the application. And this is something what is provided by Microsoft Identity Client Library. So here, of course, I provided details about configuration, and we will go through it afterwards. But you can see here that this is the login page where I can sign in with my organization account. And please note that also there is some flexibility around customization of the user interface, because there is a logo of my blog, techmindfactory.com. So here, what I can do, I can type the username. So this is a sample username. I can type the password here.
And one thing to be clear on is that when you're typing your password, these credentials are not actually visible to your website or any of the customization stuff. Just, I want to disassociate those and make it very clear for consumers of this, that when they're configuring it, that's not at all the case of what's actually happening under the covers, right?
Yeah, so when it comes to this integration, this is something what is happening on the identity platform part. Yeah, the user is redirected underneath to the identity server. User provides credentials, and then the token is returned to the application. So there is no chance to store username, password anywhere in the application. Right. It's secure.
Right.
So once I click sign in, I hope the password is correct. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So there is a small community. There is a small box. Welcome, and this is not fancy yet, but I signed in, and now what I can do, I can call API. So I can click this button, call API, and of course, right now there will be an exception because I will have to enable this API. But what we will do today, we will see how to integrate with the API to retrieve information about the user. So just to provide a small greeting between those two applications. So let me quickly set up startup projects here, multiple.
Sure. So while you're doing that, I do have a question as well, just of a selfish question. So I'm trying to envision the communication that just happened there. So you're basically authenticating against the identity server. You're getting this token back from that server. You have that token then on your client UWP application, and then you say you want to make a client a web API call. I'm assuming that you're going to use that token to make that call. Does that token have an expiration?
Yes, that's a very good question. Of course, that token has an expiration time, but by default it's 1 hour. But it can be configured, and especially when we talk about Azure AD B2C, you have a really more flexibility. But yeah, exactly. So there is expiration time, and also what's happening when the token expires in this application, it will be refreshed automatically by Msal library. Yeah, so we can provide this also offline access scope, and then the refresh token will be cached, and we can refresh those tokens underneath. Yeah, so there is a much more work moved on the library than we would do ourselves. Yeah, because you can try to imagine that to implement such mechanism ourselves, it will be time consuming for sure.
Yeah, that's what I was envisioning. Like, I don't. One thing as a developer, because I'm super lazy, I don't want to have to worry about the refresh token myself. Exactly. I don't want to have to I just want to take the token and say, here it is. Let me make my calls, and it refresh automatically for me.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why it's good to use this library, because when you try to imagine that you have to do it manually, everything related to identity and refreshing tokens, etc., it will be really hard.
Right. Okay. Perfect.
So let me sign in once again, and here I will call API. Now I hope it will work. because I enabled, you can see that there is a small greeting, hello, Daniel tester in this case. Yeah, so I have a small greeting from my API. And now what's happening underneath, let's discuss it, because I think that this is also important to mention. When you go through the code, you will notice that I have this Universal Windows Platform application, and also I have this ASP.NET Core API. So in this case, I want to call the API in context of the user and receive some data. And I would like to provide secured access to this API. So I don't want to any anonymous access for this API. Yeah. So let's discuss what's happening underneath. To do it, we have to get back to the Azure portal. So here is my Azure Active Directory tenant, and inside this tenant, let me open it. I have my applications register. So let me display this page. And of course, I will try to go smooth because I know that we have limited time, but there is a lot of different small things that has to be told just to avoid confusion. So as you can see, here are my applications registered in the Azure Active Directory tenant. So currently what I'm showing you, this is my Identity Developer Templates Universal Windows Platform application, together with Identity Developer Templates Azure AD API. So those two applications have to be registered in the Azure AD tenant. So let's look on the configuration of the Universal Windows Platform application. I registered this application by clicking here. If we get back, there is a new registration button. You can provide the name of the application. In this case, it can be changed later. Now you can select that this application will work only with your Azure AD tenant here in your organization. And of course, below, you can also select the target platform, whether it's web application, single page application, or public client native, so mobile or desktop. So this is our case. But for now, you do not have to fill it out. It can be filled out later. So let me get back to the application I configured before. Once application is created, you will notice that there is application ID. And this ID is required in the app configuration. So if we get back to the Visual Studio, you will notice that in this project, in the configuration, authentication service configuration here, I have this client ID provided. And also I have some other parameters. So I have my tenant name, so cleanarcdev on Microsoft.com. So this is the name of my Azure AD tenant. I have Azure AD instance. So this is required to redirect the user to your organization, so to your Azure AD. So this is something what we mentioned to enable authentication.
I do have a question real quick though, and this is just my naiveness coming through. The client ID, is that considered sensitive data, or does it matter that, I mean, because if that's just a public static read only or string or whatever it is here in the configuration, it's not hidden away. It's not like an environment variable. It's not a secret. It's not key vaulted. Does that matter?
Correct. So in case of client ID, no, because this is something what is publicly available. Yeah. So in this case, the client ID doesn't have to be considered as a secret, something that we have to hide. Perfect. Of course, yeah. But of course, if and this sample I will show later, there is also a client secret that is used in some cases, and this is something what should be considered as secret and should be securely stored inside your application.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So so there is also one more thing. I would like to add something to what I mentioned before with your question to client ID, because there are two parts of the applications: public client applications and confidential applications. Yeah. So for public client applications, we consider them as desktop, mobile. So those applications that are running on the user device. So you do not have control whether user will try to just discover this secret. Yeah, but there are also confidential clients like web APIs running on the server, and there you can use the secret because you have this ability to securely store this secret. Yeah, so that's the small difference I would like to add also. Yeah, so when it comes to the configuration, as you can see, there are also API scopes, which I will describe in a minute, but there is also important redirect URI. As you can see, it's MSAL, client ID, yeah, and AUTH. And this is something that is available for us here in the portal. So if I switch to the authentication section of my application, you will notice that if I click Add Platform, I can select for which platform this application is dedicated to. There are different kinds of applications, web, single page, etc. But in this case, I selected mobile and desktop application. Yeah, and here I can provide the redirect URIs. I already did it. So as you can see here, here is my redirect URI that I have to provide inside the application configuration. And you have this notice that it's for Msal only. Yeah, when you use Msal library, you can use it. So this is something what I have in my configuration. And generally speaking, for the user authentication, that's it. So once you have this client ID, once you have the name of the tenant, and once you have this redirect URI, you can set up everything here in those templates I will share with you and with users and attendees, and you can set up user authentication. And when it comes to the authentication service in this application, let me show you authentication service. Here we have the interface called iPublic Client Application. And this interface is provided by Microsoft Identity Client Library. And this interface provides methods to enable authentication for users in your app. So as you can see here, I'm creating this public client application with the client ID from the configuration I copied from the Azure portal with authority and redirect URI. So everything is from this class authentication service configuration. And then what's happening below, I can initiate authentication. So here is authentication method. It returns authentication data. So right now we can go to authentication data and see that there is only access token, but of course there can be more. So here, if I try to acquire token silent, and let's talk about this a little bit. So this is something what you ask for. The Msal library will try to acquire the new access token silently if the user is already authenticated. But if user is not already authenticated, there will be Msal UI required exception thrown, and then what you have to do, you have to handle authentication first time. So there is a method called handle first time authentication, and you can see that there is acquired token interactive. So in case of acquiring tokens silently, there is acquire token silent method. But when you want to display this window to the user and enable users to sign in, you have to call this acquire token interactive. So that's how it is in general in the code. And of course, user can cancel authentication. So we have to also catch Msal exception with authentication canceled event.
That's really interesting. I'm excited to dig more into this code because there was a question earlier where individuals were asking if UWP was dead. And I will state very boldly that it's not. It's not going anywhere. It's alive and kicking, and many developers are still actively developing enterprise applications with it. So,
yeah, so that's a good question, I think, because yeah, that's very interesting question. What I can say, we have an interesting situation in the desktop apps development, because on one side we have this universal Windows platform, and users are asking whether it's dead. On the other side we have Windows Presentation Foundation. Yeah, so I would say that still in some cases universal Windows platforms are used. So from my perspective, I had a few projects where there was implementation with universal Windows platform application. So it depends, of course. Yeah, we can talk about different scenarios, but I would say it's not that yet for me.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's just such a bold question, though. Is it dead? Like that's where it's, is it less? Is it de-emphasized? Sure. Are there new innovations around desktop development for .NET? Absolutely. But to say it's dead is I would say grossly inaccurate.
Yeah, and I mean the same could be said about tech like web forms. Some would say it's dead, but technically,
yeah, exactly.
No, it's still supported. Therefore, not dead. It's just investments have been pulled back a bit on that to focus on other aspects of the framework.
Yep.
Yeah, true. Very good example. Yeah. Thanks for adding this.
Cool. So what else you got for us?
Okay, so let's move forward. So as you can see, I also mentioned that here in the authentication service configuration class, we have those API scopes because we would like to call the API to retrieve the data and this greeting to the user. Yeah. So above, I have this API application. It's ASP.NET Core API application, and there is a user controller. And inside this controller, of course, we will discuss the details soon. But what is the most important part of it? We try to retrieve the display name of the user from Microsoft Graph, and we would like to return this information to the user. So we would like to send this hello, for instance, Daniel Tester. Yeah, and here what I did in this API. I thought that it would be interesting for other developers to see how we can call other APIs on behalf of the user. So what is the flow here? We have this universal Windows platform application. We would like to call ASP.NET Core application in context of user, but also we would like to call from this web API, we would like to make a call to the Microsoft Graph to retrieve information about the user and then return this information to the universal Windows platform application. So first of all, what we have to do, we have to register another application in the Azure AD. So here, when it comes to the application for ASP.NET Core API, you can see that I have another application here, Identity Developer Templates Azure AD API. And I created it exactly in the same way as previous application, but during the registration, redirect URI should be for web, of course, but this can be changed later. So here I have to provide the name, select accounts in organizational directory only, and then my application is created. And if I open the tab, you will notice that the user interface is exactly the same. So I have my client ID assigned for my application, which is unique. But what I can do here, I can say that, of course, for authentication, you will not find any platforms here, because what we would like to do, we would like to expose API permissions here. So what's happening there? We would like to, in this specific scenario, we would like to, on one hand, access Microsoft Graph API, and on other hand, expose our ASP.NET Core application for other applications, so we can call this API in context of user. So there are two tabs, API permissions and expose an API. Under API permissions, we can define to which permissions we would like to have access in context of the user. So let me put an example here. We have this user read permission. So here you can see that for the user read, we would like to sign in user and read her or his profile. And to add such permission, we have to click Add Permission. And here we have Microsoft Graph, but also you will notice that we can call other custom APIs that we develop inside our organization. So here I will select Microsoft Graph, and you will notice that there is delegated permissions button and application permissions. So this is something what I mentioned before. The delegated permissions are for in context of user. So we would like to call the API in context of the user and then retrieve the data from the Microsoft Graph only for this specific user, only after the user will consent that he or she agreed to do it. On the other side, we have application permissions. So it's good for the backend applications, for instance, if we would like to call Azure AD without the context of the user. So we would like to, for instance, call Azure AD and list all the users inside our directory. So then we should use application permissions. But in this case, we're using delegated permissions. So as you can see, if I scroll down, here, there are many different permissions, of course, but there is a search window, and what I can type, there is user read, I suppose, user, yeah, let me do it quickly, yeah, user, and there is user read permission, and there is a description, sign in and read user profile, yeah. And also if you mark this small icon, you will see the detailed explanation. So what is this permission for? Yeah, so here I will select user read. So I would like to access Microsoft Graph in context of signed in user. And also I would like to enable desktop application, so Universal Windows Platform, to call my API that is secured by Azure AD. So there is another section called expose an API. So in this case, what we can do, we can expose our APIs to be called by other applications in context of the user. So here I can click Add Scope, and I can provide the name of the scope, admin consents here. Yeah, so this will be displayed to the end user, and once I have it, I have this scope added here, and this scope is something that you will find in the authentication service configuration. So once I sign in user, I want to also call Azure AD for this scope. So as you can see in the Universal Windows Platform configuration, there is API scopes configuration. And here I provided this scope, Access Identity API as a user. So this is exactly what I copied from the Azure AD portal.
I feel like I've just learned so much more than I did before about the identity platform. Like, this is awesome. Thank you so much.
So cool question for you, Daniel, here. So inevitably, the Azure portal screens will evolve over time. How difficult is it to do the things you were showing us there from the Azure CLI?
Yeah, so when it comes to the Azure CLI, there is I would say that there is still the same level of features. So when it comes to the communication with Azure AD, for instance, there is a dedicated Microsoft Graph API. Yeah, so you can use it. You can register new applications and retrieve client IDs. On the other side, you can use Azure CLI to control what's happening in your Azure AD. So there is a lot of, I would say there is a lot of flexibility when it comes to the integration with Azure AD. So I'm showing you the portal, but of course, there are operations that you can do with the API and other stuff.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the questions. So I will move forward, and if there will be more, I'm happy to answer them. I hope that it's still interesting for participants, and I hope that there is not too much details about the configuration, but I wanted you to understand the concept of this communication. Yeah, so when I call the API, I have to provide the valid access token. So I have to get this access token from the Microsoft Identity Platform. So I have to request the specific scope. So in this case, this is the scope to access my Identity Developer API. So let me show you something. When I enable this, when I start this sample once again, you will notice that here, let me open this authentication service, and I was already authenticated. So yeah, so I can go here and let's put on breakpoint, yeah, here, and click sign in, and you will notice that once the user is authenticated and we have this out result that is returned by the SAL library, if I extend the properties, you will notice that there is access token, but there is also an ID token. So let me show it once again. Yeah, so here is the ID token. There is also access token. Yeah, and there is also an account property, and you will see here that, for instance, we have access to the username. So when it comes to the displaying information about the user, it can be helpful. But let me show you something. Let me copy this access token here, and let me open the page called awt.ms, and I will paste this access token. And this is the page where you can decode the JOT token and see what's inside it. And if we scroll down, you will notice that in the access token, under the SCP claim, there is this access identity API as user scope. So inside this token, when this token is sent to the API, we will do a validation to see if this scope is included, and if it's included, we will enable users to access specific controllers, for instance. So this is also important. But please note that in this token, we have some information about the user, like name, Daniel Tester, but it's very important to have this SCP scope, this claim that indicates that we have been granted the access to the specific API. So now, when I go to the API side here, so let me show the configuration. This is the API configuration. In the startup CS class, there is really a few lines of code. So this is something what I would like to also underline, that before Microsoft Identity Web Library, there was maybe not a huge work for developers to do, but still some parts of the code has to be developed by developers, yeah. And with the Microsoft Identity Web, what is really cool, that we can include those 4 lines, as you can see, and secure our web API application, and also we can add integration with calling other APIs from this API, and we can add caching tokens. So it's really cool that, as you can see here, I have services that add Microsoft Identity Web API authentication, and here I can paste the configuration. So let me show you the app settings file. You can see that there is Azure AD section. Again, I have this instance of my Azure AD. So here is the audience, client ID, domain, tenant ID, and client secret. We will discuss it later. But as you can see, this is the section for the Azure AD. And if I get back, I can just pass the configuration here, and my API will be secured by the Microsoft Identity Platform.
We do have a question real quick.
Yeah.
How are claims managed for authorization?
How are claims managed by the authorization in ASP.NET Core? A very good question. So there are a few approaches. I have one of those approaches here in my code. So in this specific scenario, I'm using policies. So as you can see, I have the services that add authorization. And here I'm adding policy called Access Identity API as user. And I have this scope requirement class. So let me show you. I have scope handler and scope requirement. Scope requirement is the requirement related to specific scope. So we require to have a specific scope in the access token. Yeah. So we require this scope to access API. And inside the scope handler here, as you can see, we in this specific scenario, first of all, we're validating if there is any value in the token that is called SCP, as you can see. So any claim called SCP or scope. And if there is an SCP, then what we're doing here, we're trying to check whether this SCP claim equals our scope requirement. So in this case, as I mentioned, we are looking for this, for Access Identity API as developer. So when I get back to the decoded token, we looking for this specific claim in the token that is related to the scope. Yeah. So to which application I will have access to with this token. But of course there are, yeah, so that's one approach, but there are a few others in the ASP.NET Core. So you can use claims, you can use policies. So, but in this case, I decided to do it as this, and it's really a fast way to configure those scope handlers. Does it make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. So we're coming up on the 5-minute warning for the show here. I do have a question for you, Daniel. Looking at your configure services method in your startup class, you're invoking an add Microsoft Graph extension method. Is there a particular NuGet package you had to install to gain access to that?
Yeah, exactly. So let me show you. Manage NuGet packages on the API project. And here, as you can see, I have Microsoft Identity Web package, but also I have Microsoft Identity Web Microsoft Graph. And with this package, I can extend the functionality and I can add integration with Microsoft Graph. And you can try to imagine that without this library, it would be really, maybe not hard, but you will have to do it yourself. But here, with one line, I can add Microsoft Graph, yeah? And I can use then Microsoft Graph Client. Let me show you here, Graph Service Client. Apologize for that. There is a Graph Service Client injected automatically, and you can use this Graph Service Client to call the Microsoft Graph API and retrieve the information about the user.
Awesome. This has been great. I was going to share this little tip here. Scott Addy actually taught me this. So if you double click on the Identity Developer Templates Azure AD API project, if you just click on that node, double click on it.
Double click, yeah.
It opens up so you can see your package references right away, which is a nice feature with the SDK style projects. Cool.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's true.
Cool. Are there, so I did want to ask you another question here. This is just a more generic question. So what are your thoughts on like how difficult it is to get up to speed on this? You had mentioned before that you're kind of newer to identity. Like you mentioned at the beginning, like during your introduction, that you've just been spending time, kind of recently diving into this. So what's your experience been like? And feel free to speak freely. Tell us the truth.
Okay. Yeah. So when it comes, so maybe I said it wrongly. So I mean, I deep dive into those libraries recently just to check different scenarios, integration scenarios. But my adventure with identity is more than 1 month, I would say. So yeah. So when it comes to the identity, I have some experience, but recently, I really deep dive into the libraries and integration with different platforms, and also just to discover what is possible with Microsoft Identity Platform. And I can say, from my perspective, that when it comes to the basic authentication setup, it's really fast, because you can try to imagine, and I suppose that those attendees who remember the integration with SQL database to store users and this framework for ASP.NET applications to provide authentication for users, it's really hard to do it yourself. You have to manage users' roles, you have to renew the tokens, you have to create those tokens. So you can think there is a bunch of stuff you have to do yourself. So, and in the end, probably you will fail, because there is no, I would say it's risky to reinvent the wheel. Yeah.
Right.
So in this case, it's much easier to use Microsoft Identity Platform, because you can register application in the Azure AD. You can use Microsoft Identity Client or Identity Web. You can add just a few lines and you are ready to go. Yeah. So that it's really simple.
Awesome. For our attendees today, I was going to ask if you could share in our private chat here, and then we'll make sure we post them, but some links to the slides or GitHub repos, any of the resources that you've shared with us throughout the course of this episode for today.
Yeah, of course, I will share. And do we have just a few 2 minutes? I will just show another sample that is available on my GitHub. Yeah. So let me quickly launch it here. So the API. This is another example that shows integration with Azure AD B2C. And as I mentioned before, there is a lot of stuff I want to show you guys, and I know that I will not be able to discuss everything, but I would like you to know that it's available on my GitHub. So this is Cars Island fake car rental company project I created, and it's available on my GitHub. It's open source, so you can just get it and use it.
It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really worked hard to provide a quite good user experience. So
yeah, it looks awesome. I like that.
Yeah, so when it comes, let me enable the API also and launch the API. It should work. Okay, it doesn't work.
It's a nice change of pace from the Bootstrap heavy apps that I created.
Okay, I know why. Yeah, thanks. Let me do a quick. Yeah, and maybe now. Yeah, okay. So this is the API project. It's written in the ASP.NET Core, and this application is a Blazor application, but server side. And as you can see, I can go to the catalog. I can see the list of available cars in this car rental company. I can reserve the car, but only when I'm authenticated. Yeah, so there is a reservation failed. You have to sign in first. So when I click login button, this application is secured by Azure AD B2C, and this is something what you ask for the explanation. Yeah, that where it's better to use Azure AD B2C, and this is the perfect scenario because I have car rental company. I want to enable users to create their accounts themselves. So here I can click sign up. Yeah, I can just provide my details about my profile, and I can create my account. But also what I can,
yeah. Sorry, I have to interrupt. I'm just getting pinged right now by John Galloway. We're stomping on his time. He needs to stream.
Okay, so you can just use it on it's available on GitHub, and it shows how to integrate with Azure AD B2C. So
sorry,
yeah,
thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on today, and we really appreciate it. Thank you to all of our viewers, and we're gonna drop Daniel. Stay on, and we're gonna throw up the ending bumper here.
Okay.